one of our podcasts for ProTeam University. You probably remember me and our other hostess. I'm the hostess.
Yeah. Call me whatever you want. Yeah.
I'm trying to be too formal, but Mike is on with us again today, and it's important that he's on with us today because the topic again is really related into my wheelhouse on the therapy side as an athletic trainer working with the tactical population and first responders. But it also bridges over into Mike's world and the performance side when we talk about tactical mobility. And I guess I want to start off by saying mobility and flexibility are not the same thing. And I will talk about that. We'll dive into that in a couple minutes here, why that's important. But I think whenever I'm rehabilitating somebody, whether it's a firefighter or a police officer, and I show them mobility, the first thing they say is, well, I've never been flexible. And I really, like, I want to tell them I don't care. That's what I really want to say. So there, I said it in a podcast, but I haven't said it in person to my patients because I find that to be rude and bad bedside manner. But that's when I usually go into my spiel on how mobility and flexibility are different. And if you have mobility, you'll have flexibility. But if you have flexibility, like you don't always have mobility. They're not the same thing. So I want to talk about that today from a prehab injury prevention standpoint, because I get those questions all the time. Like I'll be treating somebody for their knee and they're like, I've had this shoulder thing for a really long time. And like, then we start talking about that and I go into my patient education and it's great for both of us. I'm so glad they trust me enough to like ask them about other things that maybe I'm not treating them for. But I kind of like also overwhelm them, I think, when they're like, wow, I just never thought of it that way. And it is a different way to think. But especially at ProTeam, like the value we place on movement assessment, that was our first podcast. Um, we just think that it's the, I don't know, the foundation to everything. Like if you're a bad mover, you're going to be it's going to affect your power. It's going to increase your injury, your rate of injury and your risk of injury. It's going to essentially make you a lesser of a performer. And I know that all the people we work with want to perform at their prime.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's in the gym or at home with their family or at work. So that's why it's so important. So we need to maybe like shift the mindset of the first responder to value mobility and to value movement outside of gear. Because if you're a bad mover outside of gear, then you're just going to be a worse mover in your gear that's already restrictive and already kind of making you compensate. Comes with the territory. But the first thing I wanted to focus on was the topic and the why. I don't know if there's any more you want to like elaborate on for the why and the purpose and importance of mobility for the tactical population.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things I tell people, it's mainly athletes, but we can say it to firefighters and police officers too, is if you can't bend, you can't play. So if you can't bend your knees, if you can't bend your hips, if you can't, bend your elbow the way it's supposed to go, then you're going to have a tough time in an athletic world playing your sport. But in a tactical world, getting into positions and postures that you need to, get through a building or jump over a fence or crawl or whatever the case may be is. And I think, having that mindset, okay, hey, you got to bend first and be able to do some different things and get into positions is a good starting point. And I think everyone can get into an athletic position. I think that's the goal. Can you get into a position where you can be athletic? And we're talking about tactical athletes. So that might look a tad different than a traditional athlete, but there's still a goal there. And, just doing power cleans and heavy squats all day may not get it there. So I think that's a good place to start in terms of that.
Yeah. And like, when I talk to folks about like squatting or bending or hinging, sometimes their first answer is, well, I don't do that. I'm like, well, you go to the bathroom,
Mm-hmm.
you
Yep.
pick up things off the floor, you pick your kids up, you're doing it all day long. You just don't know you're doing it. That's just an everyday sense.
Mm-hmm.
So in the work sense, especially when you're injured, you might have to get in and out of your vehicle differently. Jumping out of the back of a Bearcat, I've had the pleasure, if that's the word I'd use, of doing. Like it is low to the ground. Well, you are low inside of it. You're jumping down to some sort of a height and adrenaline is pumping. So you're like not thinking about what you're really doing. But the more we can make you good mover unconsciously, the better. Like we have to kind of train it in you during rehab. And unfortunately, that's a reactive place to be because you're injured now and we're rehabbing you. If you have the pleasure of working with like a really skilled tactical therapist, not everyone listening to this might, but it's definitely a specialty area to understand, like you said, those kind of things. Like, what is it like even getting in the gear? Like putting on an SCBA tank takes some freaking shoulder mobility, um,
Hmm.
while you're already in a turnout coat, which already
Hmm.
restricts your mobility. So like if you can't
Hmm.
do like the simple behind the back test, whew, like
Hmm.
that's just that's basic stuff. And if you can't do that, then you really have no business like doing a lot of like overhead cleaning or pressing. Like you need that thoracic mobility and that scapular thoracic movement first. Because
Hmm.
otherwise you're probably just working out your freaking neck at that point. Like if you're
Hmm.
even doing it right. So I don't really know
Yep.
what you're working out, to be quite honest.
I mean, yeah, the amount of times I've seen someone like crank their neck or like just you can see the veins popping out of someone's neck just doing a basic overhead movement. And it's like, well, that shouldn't be happening, you know? So
Yeah.
it's like that's the last
Yeah.
thing we want. So that's a good point.
Yeah. So, it's all that stuff. And then even more so that was a good fire example, but I'd say for our like beat officers or for our law enforcement, like when you're in that resistor situation, you want to be more agile than them. You want to be able to get off your back quicker than them. You want to be able to predict their next movement. I know a lot of the officers I work with inherently do like BJJ or some kind of martial arts, which makes sense because you have to fight smart these days. Like you're not out on the street stand up fighting anymore. You are like in a full brawl on the ground, rolling around, protecting your weapon, protecting yourself, protecting your backup, and things are just going 100 miles an hour. But if your body, so to speak, is not bulletproof, like no amount of your ballistic vest and everything else can like really protect you. You've got to be agile. You
Hmm.
got to be mobile. So we even in our clinic when people are rehabbing back from an injury, like we do a lot of up down drills. We do, when you think of like your football days and you're like down and they just pop down and pop back up off their chest and do their quick feet. I mean, maybe we're
Hmm.
not doing that, but a version of that that's pertinent to first responder, police officer, law enforcement, because like I don't know how many times my patients get hurt falling down. Like they grabbed a curb the wrong way or they're on gravel road and just slid the right way. Like you got to pop right back up and keep going, and they normally do, and then jump that fence, and then you got to fight even when you're tired.
What's funny about that is like working with football players or just athletes in general, you're preaching urgency to them, which if you think about it is just like a tactical athlete. You may be on your stomach just chilling there for whatever goes, something goes wrong in the public, you got to literally pop up and get up as fast as you possibly can go. And it's funny you bring that up because I was just working with some football players earlier, and our warm up consisted of stepping off the box, getting off your stomach as fast as you can, getting back down to the ground, and getting back up. So it's exactly what you just said, and
Mm-hmm.
people don't realize the crossover to the tactical population of just because you're not playing a sport doesn't mean you're not doing those same things. And it just goes back to the fact that it's about human performance, not just tactical, not athletic. It's just human performance in general. And if everyone takes that into account, our society is going to be healthier. We'll have healthier cops, healthier firefighters, and less injuries, and we can go down that whole rabbit hole. But it's just not a lot of people know about it. It's just one of those things where that's part of this podcast, just educating people on what those things are.
And like even more so, right? Like I've started to do this in my own workouts, and I'll keep this brief because this is not about me, but like I've become very, I don't know how to say this. I'm starting to really value like neuroplasticity. Like I know it's a thing and I know it's real. It's like kind of the saying, like you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But like you can, it's just harder because the neuroplasticity of your brain and your ability to learn and adapt and create new synapses. So like even having small children now, like getting down on the ground, getting up quickly, like I've started to do more of that in my workouts versus just like your standard push pull and lift, like actually carry, drag, up, down, all the things. So like it's starting to look really unconventional, but like it's actually very conventional.
Hmm.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, it's just kind of all that stuff. Like how long can you be limber and play with your grandkids and just do the things you like to do
Hmm.
forever. which kind of is a nice segue into our like mobile and stable topic. And this is the other um, discussion that I get into with my patients about what's mobile, what's stable. So when we look at the body, just like the skeleton standing there in like the anatomical position, so your hands are out at your side, your feet are just underneath you, and you're just standing there. And we look at every segment of the body, starting at the let's start at the feet. So like if we look at our ankles, that should be mobile. Our knees should be stable. Our hips should be mobile. Our lumbar spine should be stable. Our thoracic spine or our ribs should be mobile. Neck should be stable. But a lot of times we see almost like the exact reverse relationship with these things. Like people who come in with knee injuries, I look at their ankles and they barely have any dorsiflexion. I look
Mm-hmm.
at people, I look at their hips and they barely have any internal rotation. And so because we're not mobile where we need to be, then we become mobile where we're supposed to be stable in our knee. And then like, boom, we tear our meniscus or ACL or whatever it is. And they're like, all I did was step off a curb weird. Well, that's all you needed to do because you couldn't support yourself in a dynamic position and an unstable surface. And your knee that's supposed to be stable is now mobile. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not meant to do that. That's how we hurt
Right.
our knees. It doesn't take much. So
Right.
understanding those relationships and how to create a better synergy and make what's mobile, mobile, make what's supposed to be stable, stable. There's a great course on ProTeam University about this. If you go into the rehab, like injury prevention course category, there's the upper quadrant one, there's a lower quadrant one, and we go through all of that. There's
Mm-hmm.
also a free course that kind of gives you just a bit of a deeper dive into what I'm talking about. It's a much shorter one, but the other courses, like you are really dedicating some time to learning what should be mobile, what should be stable, injury prevention, and then like drills for each one. So if you're interested in more of that, definitely check that course out. And then to the topic of mobility and flexibility is the other thing I kind of like started on. They're just different. And I get really like soapboxy on this. So I don't know if you want to like give me your 2 cents first.
Well, I'm going to go back to the connect chain for a second. So some people forget about the arch of the foot and the scapula, the shoulder blade, those two things too. So you can technically start at the arch of the foot where that arch is supposed to be stable, then the ankle's mobile, and then you kind of plug in that shoulder blade a little bit because people's feet are jacked up these days. They're messed up. People have
Yeah,
no
well, I
arch.
think it's just because we like don't we support our feet too much. Like we don't do
Yeah,
enough. Like I'm not out here saying like I'm a barefoot runner, but I
right.
let my kids play without shoes on all the time because I'm
Hmm.
like, get your feet strong. That's your like that's the first thing that touches the ground in the morning. That's your shock absorption. Like you know
Hmm.
all the things that I'm talking about, but you couldn't be more right. And I like blame it on our footwear over eons and eons of years.
What's funny is anytime I'm coaching somebody in squats or anything with the any exercise in general, because everything's technically full body, it's always teaching them how to plant their foot in the ground, how to spread their feet out, how to grab the ground, where the torque's coming from, all
Mhm.
that stuff. Because once we fix that, everything pretty much works its way up the chain. We've had guys with like knee injuries and things like that where they fix the arch of their foot and all of a sudden they're bounced back out, and it's like, okay, that fixed the issue. Same with shoulder problems. Their shoulder blades are moving in all directions. Their shoulders a little more free. It's able to get in different positions. So, I mean that. Okay, so the back to your next point, which is mobility and flexibility, right? I mean, my thing is like flexibility has to do with your actual muscle, right? You're trying to stretch that muscle. That could be an active or passive thing depending on how you look at it. The mobility is like that joint. Where's that joint going? That range of motion of the joint. Where if I'm doing a lateral squat and I'm squatting to one side, I got to be mobile. I got to be mobile on one side and stable on another to kind of help that movement pattern. So that's the main difference. Like you said, someone might not be able to touch their toes and they're going to say, "Well, I'm not mobile. I'm not flexible." But they can knock out a lateral lunge without having these perfectly flexible hamstrings or parts of the leg. So it's kind of re-educating people on what those actually mean. And I rarely use the word flexibility anymore.
Mhm.
Maybe at the end of training sessions when we're like statically stretching or doing something else, but we're always doing mobility or active, passive. We're not using flexibility too often.
I just don't see the applicability in like a
Right.
standard, even like laying down hamstring stretch,
Mm-hmm.
seated butterfly. Like, how does that translate into the real world?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
What we started doing was if someone does do a butterfly, we start adding active tension into it instead of like calling it a growing stretch. So we'll do things like pails and rails, which is like angular,
Mhm.
loading and all that kind of the FRC nod on that, where we're making it more active for them. So it's not they're just sitting there, I'm gonna stretch my groin out or my hip flexors, whatever. It's like, no, this is an active kind of thing, and we're really dialing it in. And same with the hamstring stretch or whatever you want to call it. We're adding in dorsiflexion with it. We're adding in internal external rotation of the hip. So yeah, we are getting a hamstring stretch, but we're working the joints around that to make it more efficient. Really, that's kind of what we've started to do.
Well, yeah, because like whatever you're about to go do requires both of those things to work together. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like the synergy. So they both
Right.
matter. But I don't know when I came up with this saying or phrase. There's a sign for it in our clinic now, but I always say mobility matters more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I put a lot of stock into mobility. Maybe that's because people aren't as familiar with it. Like they all, like I said, the first thing they tell me is like, I've never been flexible. And like I said, I don't care. I mean, I do, we'll
Right.
get there, but I care more about
Right.
teaching you about mobility and why it matters.
Right.
Um,
100%.
yeah, and like just to kind of wrap up here, the tactical implications we've mentioned a lot already, like can you spring right back up after someone pushes you over in a resistor? Can you spring right back up after you've fallen down a set of stairs? We hear all the time with firefighters like getting hurt just getting off the apparatus because of how high up it is. So like are you able to just can your feet absorb your force landing in those like kind of not a dynamic boots that you have to wear because like you have to wear them for your own protection. So to your earlier point, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a perfect example of what we mean by like we have to have strong feet. The other thing I thought too is like the number of like foot soft tissue injuries skyrockets when my recruits hit the mat for ST or DTs, like if they're
Mm.
not wearing wrestling shoes.
Mm.
And now like I'm like, I wonder if it's because they have weak feet. Like,
I
I
don't
don't know.
know.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna ponder that a little more. But
Well, it's interesting because every time you work with a firefighter, or tactical athlete, even a traditional athlete, something always comes up. Okay, why the hell did that happen? So just
mhm,
because of this, it's constant problem solving, and it's a lot of it has to do with the gear, right? That's number one, right? I mean, if you think about it, if they're trying to put a pack on their back, like you mentioned earlier with the shoulders, then you may get someone hurt just putting their gear on, which is not a good thing. We don't want people getting hurt during training, all that good stuff, but again, it's just how do we get it's the giving them that little dose of medicine that they know they need, but they just don't want to take it. Um, when we do evaluations with our DARI assessments and everything, the first most of the stuff that comes up is mobility stuff, obviously, but we get some people that are mobile and they can't control it. They're just out of control with it. Like they have really good hip range of motion, but they don't know where it's going. So
mhm,
that's another part to that too, where there needs to be some relative stability in some of those mobile areas. Otherwise, you're just out of whack and you don't know where that thing's going. So I
right.
think it goes hand in hand, which is like it's like advanced kinetic chain talk where it's, well, it can be, maybe, who knows? So
But there's
it's just,
probably a course on ProTeam University that can answer those questions for you too.
yeah, there you go.
This is just more so our opinion and what we get a lot of, and we just want to give you a peek inside our brains. But I think it just the implications are really like career longevity.
Hmm.
Do you feel good as a person or as a first responder? Like if you're chronically injured, maybe we need to ask why. Like maybe it's because of these things, and it's just stuff like that. So that's why it should matter to the people listening. It matters deeply to us because this is the business that we're in, and we all just want our people to feel really good and like empower them with as much information as we possibly can. But I mean, it's kind of like building a mansion on a sand pit. If you don't know these things, understand these things, really place value in these things and take the time to do them.
100%. Yep. It's just building, yeah, building a foundation. That's the number one thing. And if people try to, outplay the physiology and like try to speed things up in that microwave society kind of room, they got to slow cook it. If you don't
Mm.
slow cook it, then you're going to have way more injuries. And I think we see that mostly in the academies where it's like, we got to get this person going rather than let's just slow this down and make sure they're healthy and going to be the most efficient officer or firefighter you can possibly be. So I think that's the main lesson on that.
Yeah, the long game for sure.
Exactly.
That's my phrase of the week, it feels like.
Yep, for
Um,
sure.
but yeah, I think that's kind of like the big pieces of that topic. But like I said, there are courses on ProTeam University, and please browse them. There's an explanation of what each course entails. But the upper quadrant and the lower quadrant ones will definitely hit these points. The free one will definitely take what we're saying into a more course related method of explaining it, but we're really thrilled that anyone decided to listen in on Mike and I's 2 cents on the topic. And we'll hopefully have another podcast out here soon. That will be another area of focus within ProTeam University. So have a great rest of your day, anyone who is listening, and thank you for your support.